Good morning and happy St. Stephen's Day here from Ireland. I know a lot of you have been asking about the castle that we're staying in and what it's like and what it looks like. And we have been on tour every day that we could. And then yesterday was Christmas and we just decided to chill out, kind of catch our breath because it's been a breakneck speed. It's all been incredible. Today actually happens to be the first day. I don't know if you can see it. It is raining, not too bad though. It's about 49 degrees Fahrenheit, so fairly typical for an Irish winter. It's very, very, very rare that they get snow or ice. Normally it's just gray and rainy. We've had maybe a half hour of rain total all the other days that we've been here. So figured this would be a good time to take a little tour of the castle. I'll do some video. I'm not used to videoing. I'm not used to being on video, so I'm probably gonna mess this up. Sorry in advance. I'll try to tell you a little bit about it before we get into the castle, which I'm half standing in, half standing out so I don't get wet. The history of the castle is both short and long. There's a lot of nuance in Irish history. So for those of you who, with a short attention span, I'll give you a real quick history. And then you want to fast forward to when you start seeing the inside of the castle. And for those of you who like a little nuance, then hang on with me and I'll try to explain a little bit of it. The short history really involves three and only three dates. The castle we're staying in was built in 1249 by Andrew, and of course now I forget his name. I want to say it was Andrew Kingsgay, something like that, the third. He was the grandson of what they call a Norman colonist. So yes, the Normans, William the Conqueror from England, about 100 years later, they came over to Ireland. One of those people, his grandson, built the castle here. The other major date, or the second major date in this, would be in the 1650s when Oliver Cromwell came over and he basically kicked the Norman family out and installed George Staunton, who was an ally of his, was another Puritan, and so kind of repressed the area. Again, that whole Protestant Catholic thing going on. Shortly after Staunton moved in, he brought his family over. They looked at Carraigin and said, over your dead body. So they built a mansion 2 to 3 miles to the south of here. And in fact, they destroyed the tower and part of the upper levels, taking stone and timber for use at the new mansion. So at that point, the castle was abandoned, started to fall into ruin. In the 1800s, they took the roof off. You'll find that any domicile in Ireland, well, in Great Britain, that had a roof was deemed habitable, and so you were taxed. And so one way that people who had old buildings on their properties would try to escape tax was they would take the roofs off. Unfortunately, this hastened their destruction by the natural elements. But in the 1800s, the roof was, what was left of the roof, I should say, was taken off of Carraigin, and it was abandoned really for about 250 years. In the late 1960s, Christopher Murphy, a local gentleman, bought the castle, renovated it, rebuilt it, and opened it in 1970 as a guest house, and now it's, a proper bed and breakfast. You can get it on Airbnb or VRBO, or if you happen to have a friend who's a tour guide, like we do, you can book through your tour guide as well. I definitely recommend that if you can, because it does skip a lot of those booking fees that Airbnb and VRBO tend to impose that don't go anywhere except out of your pocket. For those of you who want a little more nuance, let's go back. So it was Gaylord, by the way. See, you hang on, you get the real history. So Andrew Gaylord III was the grandson of one of the Norman, what they like to call colonists. It's a polite term. Remember, the Normans came over because one of the Irish kings on the East Coast was kicked off his throne. So he went to England and said, hey, if you give me men and armies, I want to take my throne back and I will pledge allegiance to you. So that happened. Unfortunately, the English turned around and said, we're staying and we're going to run the show. So Andrew Gaylord was a grandson of those initial soldiers that came over and basically conquered Ireland for England. He is part of the de Burgo family, which later became the O'Burke clan. And they were centered in the Galway area, which is where we are, and up the Connacht coast. And Connacht is simply the westernmost region, kind of west central. So if you find Galway and you just start going up the coastway, that's all Connacht. And the de Burgos or O'Burkes ruled that for centuries. So what happened between then and Oliver Cromwell is not real documented. Most people will tell you pretty much a lot of nothing happened. This is not an actual castle. It's what's called a fortress keep. I would go out and show you, but it is raining and I'm actually dressed rather nicely and I don't want to get wet. So take a look at the photos that I posted earlier. The difference between palaces and castles, and this is a fortress house or a tower house is what they're called. Castles have to have what's called a curtain wall. It's a protective wall beyond the castle. It has to be more than 4 feet tall, hence the term curtain wall, because a curtain is much longer or higher. So this lacks that protective wall. Palaces likewise lack protective walls. So castles have them. Castles were huge or large administrative centers. A tower keep holds a single family and was really during the Norman times the norm for a ruling family throughout Ireland. Castles were very rare just because of the amount of building and maintenance they required, where a tower keep was pretty simple. It's basically a tower, typically 3 stories, maybe a couple of branches off the main building, and that was about it. So they were fortified homes. They tended to be elegant. They were the homes of the larger ones were certainly the ruling families. And then you might have some smaller ones for local administrators who would be governing a town or a group of villages, whatever the case may be. So we are actually in what's called a tower keep, even though they call it castle. It's a misnomer, but hey, it's romantic either way, so who cares? So again, going back to our history, Andrew Gaylord III was the grandson of Norman conquerors, essentially. Now, the Normans eventually Celticized. They began marrying the local population. They began speaking Irish. They started taking on and being sympathetic to the traditional Irish laws. And that happened for centuries, several centuries up until Oliver Cromwell. In that interim, there may have been a few raids. There are some indications that there might have been a couple of raids, but on the whole, it really was a lord and lady's house and an administrative center. That was really about it. 1650s, Oliver Cromwell. For those of you who know your history, you're probably thinking, Oliver the Bastard. And yes, for those of you who don't know, Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan. And the Puritans, we know from American history, they were Protestants who were much more strict. We would, in our modern political climate, we would call them extremists. They were not popular. And even amongst their own Protestant members, they were just considered too extreme. At the time when England was between monarchs, Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector of the English Empire and abolished the monarchy. And being a Puritan, he also tried to abolish Catholicism. And he led several raids into Ireland, being a strong bastion of Catholicism, and especially in the West, where the Norman lords tended to be more Irish, even though they were Norman. They were more Irish than they were English. Oliver and his army came through. He would kick the family out, so the Gaylord family got kicked out. He installs a Puritan friend of his, George Staunton, and George goes from managing and developing the area to oppressing it, especially if you were Catholic. And again, you already heard that his family did not want to stay in the house. They wanted to build something that they felt was more English and civilized. So they did scuttle the entire tower and part of the upper level of the castle taking the stones and the timbers to build their mansion. So the place was basically in ruins for a couple of centuries. Fortunately, I mean, the walls you're going to see, the outer walls at least, are about 2 feet thick. So the thing stood. During the Troubles, the IRA did come in. They did, quote, burn the place down. There wasn't much wood left for them to burn. But again, they were trying to send a signal to the English I say overlords, but of course this was the 1970s and 1980s, to the English government that they didn't care what the property was, who it belonged to. They were going to burn the English out in any kind of history that they had here. Again, you hear that it was burnt, but there wasn't really much damage because, as you'll see, the bulk of this is stone. So the castle stood. Ironically, gentleman in the 60s, Christopher Murphy, lived in the area, had fallen in love with several of these castles that were in ruin. Carraigin came up for sale, and he bought it, he restored it, made it into basically a bed and breakfast. And then, irony of ironies, he and his wife moved to London. So it has now come full circle. It's been Irish, it's been English dominated by Irish, it's been Irish, and now the Irish live in England. But you're going to find anybody who studies history in this part of the world, that's normal. It all comes full circle. So we're about to go inside. What you're going to see is obviously how it is now from roughly the 1970s on. The original Tower Keep would have been laid out fairly differently. We have 3 primary levels, and then there's a tower level as well. So if you want to call it 4 stories, more or less. The first floor, what you would have seen would have typically been a small office. And this is where the Lord could have met people, whether they're on his estate or from the local town. These were smaller meetings that didn't need a lot of intimacy. So there would have been an office here. And then there's an area which are converted into bedrooms called the vaults. And these were simply storerooms. You would have also seen if the Lord had a lot of older kids. They tended to have a lot of kids because unfortunately a lot of them died in childhood. But if they started to have some really older kids, some of them might get moved down into the vaults or into these storerooms to afford them a little bit of privacy, and definitely to afford the parents some privacy. When we go 1 floor up, that is the great room. Now it's now been divided into a great room and a separate bedroom and a bathroom. One thing you're probably suspecting or dying to ask, no, back in the 1200s and even up through the 16, 17, and even the early 1800s, bathrooms and kitchens were not part of buildings. They were outside. So when you see these spaces, understand that they were something else at one time. So on the second floor, and I need to explain as well, in America, we tend to say ground floor and then first floor, meaning the floor above, or the first floor above the ground floor. In Europe, the first floor is the ground floor, and then the second floor is the floor above that. So if you ever come over, don't get confused by it. So the second floor is the great room, and at that time, it would have all been great room. Part of it may have been petitioned off as a slightly more private space. It definitely would have been for children that were old enough to sleep on their own. Again, this is not a castle, even though it's called that. It was a fortress keep, so it tended to be just the family. However, they may have a live-in servant. It could be a combination nanny, cook, or they may have had a man-at-arms, just an extra strong hand to help around the castle and to help defend against a raid, but that wasn't necessarily the norm. Then the rest of the great room was where they could do large parties or festivals, where they could do large meetings. And when there wasn't territory administration involved, then it really was just a common room. It was a place for the family to gather where mending could be done. They could work their wool. They could weave it, stitch, sew, embroider. They could educate. So if a tutor was hired, the tutor would come and would teach in the great room, things along those lines. The third floor is actually a loft that overlooks the great room, and this would have been the bed chambers for the Lord and Lady and any children that were too young to sleep on their own. And then the final floor was actually in the tower, which I took some photos of the other day. I'm probably not going to go up there. There's two ways to get to it. From the outside, which is raining. From the inside, there is a very narrow stairwell, and you're going to see some stairwells. They are all stone. They're rough hewn. And those stairs are even thinner and smaller and slipperier. So probably not going to head up that way, but I'll show you. Again, you can look at the photos I posted a day or two ago of the tower room and see what it's just very small, and it would have been used for stores. It would have stored ammunition as well. There is an entryway onto the roof, and another purpose for these tower keeps was defense. So typically the tower keeps were built within line of sight of each other. So where we are, if you were to go up onto the roof, you might see, or you ought to see in the distance, another tower keep, and they would keep some kind of a signal fire. So if there was any threat or any danger, one of the tower keeps would light their fire, and any others within line of sight would be able to see it, and they would know that there was some kind of danger or threat present in that area, and they could respond accordingly. With that, let's get out of the rain, and I'm going to take you around and show you what the castle looks like from the inside. So there are actually two doors into Carraigin, and we are about to walk through one of them. I'm going to show you the big, and it is a giant door. This thing is easily 3.5, 4 feet across, and you can also get a feel for the stone. It's pretty intense. So we're going to come in to the room, and this is our entryway. Let me close the door here. Yep, our door handle is not modern. It is fairly traditional, and in fact, if you want to lock it, you take this piece of wood and you shove it in here so that the crossbar can't go up anymore. So, kind of fun. So our entryway into the castle. Straight across is the first floor bathroom and laundry room. If you hear the occasional beep, 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 I apologize. I'm doing laundry right now, and that's the washer telling me that I need to change it. So decoration, now again, none of the decoration here is original. It's all been purchased from other places, other times. Again, the north, well, all of the coast of Ireland were invaded by the Vikings, and the Vikings actually ended up settling here. So it's not uncommon to see artwork like we're seeing here, I'm hoping. It's not uncommon to see artwork like this. This is slightly more Norman style. The other tapestry was a little bit more, was actually referencing the Vikings, and then a very, very old map of Ireland. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video now so I can turn it around and see what I'm doing, since you don't need to see me, and we'll continue from there.